I became a convicted federal felon over $7,500 worth of computer equipment. This was not the type of crime people normally picture when they think of a federal felony. I was a business owner buying surplus computer equipment. Ultimately, I received 30 days probation, but it took roughly 4 years to get through it. I own an electronics recycling business, so I oftentimes purchase computer equipment through auctions, including a website called gsaauctions.gov. So in this instance, that's what I was doing. I was purchasing some TSA computers through gsaauctions.gov throughout the United States. Eventually, one of the other buyers on this computer equipment contacted me and ultimately wanted to work together purchasing these computers from the government. At the time, I didn't have any desire to really do that, but he was persistent and I eventually agreed to it. And I did not know at that time what kind of consequences that choice would have. But ultimately, the government characterized this conduct as bid rigging, price fixing and market allocation, and it was a violation of the Sherman Act. So I was buying computers, and because this other guy was buying the same computers and he wanted to work together with me, that created an antitrust violation. Total, I purchased about $65,000 worth of computers, but combined, we only purchased about $7,500 worth of computers. So even though we only purchased a limited number of computers together, because I purchased $65,000 total, that's what I was charged with. Ultimately, you don't have to think of yourself as some criminal mastermind to wind up in the crosshairs of the government and ultimately end up with a felony. The moment this ultimately became real was when I had 6 federal agents show up at my house at 6 a.m. on a school day. This is when I realized that something I was doing was considerably wrong. I made decisions during that encounter that ultimately, with what I know today, I would approach differently. There's a whole story about what happened that morning, and I'm going to tell that separately because there are things I did that morning that I would handle very differently today. Ultimately, I pled guilty and cooperated with the government. The federal sentencing guideline said that I could serve 8 to 14 months in federal prison for this crime, and that really just blew my mind. Along with that, I could have a fine and restitution. So ultimately, the government submitted a downward departure from my sentencing, and they ultimately wanted me to serve 1 year on probation. Not even 1 year in prison, 1 year on probation. So I had the possibility of going 8 to 14 months in prison, and the government ultimately sought 1 year of probation. Part of the biggest problem with this is I pled guilty in 2019. There were lots of issues around that time, between COVID interrupting the court. Also, this case was out of Minneapolis, Minnesota, so we also had the George Floyd incident that caused delays in this. As well as that, there were 2 other co-defendants on this whose cases had to go first and their sentencing had to happen before mine. So that gave me years, of not knowing what exactly was going to happen to me. Because at this point, I didn't even know that the government only wanted 1 year of probation. Prison time was still a real possibility in my mind. So sentencing was ultimately scheduled for, I think it was February in Minneapolis, Minnesota. and it ultimately was scheduled for a time when a big snowstorm hit the US. So this is the day before I'm supposed to be in Minneapolis for sentencing on a federal felony. My flight is canceled. So I contact my attorney and ask him if, or just let him know that, hey, I'm going to try my best to be there in the morning when I'm supposed to be, but I'm getting ready. I'm packing the truck. I'm getting ready to drive from Dallas to Minneapolis. So with the way the roads are, I may be late. So he told me, hold on for a second, don't go anywhere. And he went ahead, contacted the court, and we were able to do this virtually. So instead of going to Minneapolis, I went over to my parents' house the next day because it was quieter. And we continue with the sentencing hearing. My attorney was arguing that I'd received enough punishment, that these 4 years of uncertainty plus everything else going on was more than enough punishment for me. And so he wanted no further sentence imposed upon me when I walked out that day. At this point, this is when I learned that the government's asking for 1 year probation, which isn't bad. The judge comes back with a sentence that neither attorney was asking for, and he said 30 days probation. Roughly 4 years of sitting there, not knowing, ultimately ended with 30 days of probation. So only 30 days probation doesn't really tell the whole story, though. $50,000 in legal fees, the stress of not knowing that whole time, plus now, even though I've only got 30 days probation, I'm a federal felon. Not only that, during COVID, I wasn't sure how the business was going to be, so I applied for a PPP loan, and the government denied that request because I was untrustworthy because of this whole situation. So throughout this whole process, there were a lot more consequences than 30 days probation. So I take complete responsibility for what I did. I did not know it was wrong and against the law at the time, but once it was explained to me and I figured it out, I took responsibility, and that's why I pled guilty, is because, yeah, I did do it, whether I knew it or not. But I take full responsibility. I know that I made a mistake, and I have to move on from that. Federal investigations are handled a lot different than state and local, and so once you get in trouble with the feds, it's very hard to get out of it. That's why most people plead to cases with the feds, because if you take it to trial with them, they have like a 99% success rate. I mentioned earlier about how the federal agent showed him up in my door at 6 a.m. and how that's a whole nother story. So don't forget to like and subscribe so you can hear all about that story of me sitting on the toilet at 6 a.m. when federal agents knock on my door.